So it's good to see you, man.
Good to see you.
We crossed paths last summer downstate, and now you're here.
Yep.
I want to jump right in. As mentioned, you're this is kind of like a second part of a book in a way that you wrote, similar title, just earlier, bringing us from the World's Fair. Well, almost I guess really kind of between the World's Fairs,
Sure.
and how the city skyscrapers and how the city grew. Now we're further. We're from the 30s to the 80s. Contrast the two times for me. Not an activity, but contrast the two times.
So the earlier phase, the 60 years between the Great Fire and Great Depression, Chicago is the biggest boomtown in the United States, right? And people come here to make money. They come here to bet on the price of wheat or corn. And eventually they need places to work, and they start to move in and realize that they can also bet on the price of land, right? So it's a place that is full of kind of fiscal buccaneers, I like to think of them. Whereas in the post-war era, this is the second city, right? Chicago gets hit by the Depression harder than almost any city in the country. And there are people who are writing the city's obituary, even in the 1950s. So it's a city with something to prove, always has been. But in the post-war era, it's really a place that needs a little bit of a push to get things done, to get things built. And so the city government takes a much more active role eventually in rebuilding the city, and skyscrapers are really the kind of game pieces almost that they use to make that happen.
And as a city takes that role to get into the 50s, there's one person sits on the fifth floor who takes a huge, almost outsized role. You say, and I think you're right, you said at one point in the book that you think he was likely the most powerful mayor in America during that time. And that's saying something, given what's happening in Boston and New York and other cities. But old man Daly, he had a pretty big muscle. Talk about that in terms of first downtown, and then we'll get out into the neighborhoods with some of the images that we see here.
Sure. Daly, as any student of Chicago history knows, pulls a fast one to get elected mayor. He's in charge of the Democratic machine, and he basically says, who would make a good candidate? I would make a good candidate. But then he does something else, which is that when he becomes mayor, he keeps the position as Democratic chair, which means that he basically gets to choose city council as well. And that means that the Chicago mayor as a position goes from being a weak mayor position to basically having unlimited power, because Daly controls the city council, he controls the small fiefdoms that the mayor has. And one of the first things that he does is he gets his staff and he gets business leaders from all over the city, and he flies them to Detroit and he flies them to Pittsburgh. And he says, both of these cities have these urban renewal projects, Cobo Arena in the area around downtown Detroit, the Golden Triangle in Pittsburgh. He says, Chicago needs this. And when they come back, the group that's on that plane forms the Central Area Committee, which later becomes an advisory panel to the Central Area Plan. And the Central Area Plan is Daly's strategy for rebuilding the Loop, reinvigorating it economically, but also rebuilding it, making it into a place that sort of buries the old and presents itself as being very new. And to do that, he not only needs businesses to invest downtown, he needs people downtown. And so in addition to the sort of tax breaks and the sort of zoning regulations that are going to change, the Central Area Plan very cleverly looks at the area in what today is River North, the Gold Coast, South Loop, and Daly and Ira Bach, who writes the Central Area Plan, realize that you need people to make the businesses stay. So there's this huge idea about housing for the middle class, for professionals that are going to sort of nourish the loop, right, with workers. And that comes along with all the highways, the expressways, and things that connect the suburbs to downtown. But the Central Area Plan really is a strategy about keeping the 52 or 53 blocks of the loop healthy by bringing in not only the kind of investment from corporate and city, state and federal government, but also realizing that the tendrils that come out of that need to be populated too. And the skyscraper is the most effective way he realizes to get those areas populated.
So with that, we start to see things like, like Marina City and Sandburg Village. Talk about these kind of.
Yeah. So Marina City, I think, is maybe the most important project maybe of the era, because it changes the game in terms of how residential construction happens downtown. Daly, this is a project that the janitors union downtown sort of spearheads, right? They realize that they have skin in the game, right? If the loop gets deserted, their union members don't work. And so they lead the financing to try to build this first project that's going to put workers within walking distance of the loop. The Daly administration goes to Washington and says, if we're going to do projects like this, we need to have the same sort of mortgage insurance that the feds give for single-family houses. And so Marina City is the first project in the country to get federal mortgage insurance for a high-rise apartment building. And it happens right after the 1960 election. Kennedy may owe Daly a favor at that point. And it gets fast-tracked, and it gets done. The city also, it's the first planned unit development. In other words, the first zoning piece, it's right here, in fact, the first project to take advantage of what today we call mixed-use zoning. Right before this, it's illegal to have commercial and residential in the same project. And of course, that we know today, like that's one of the ways to make vital projects that size. City says it has to be 4 acres to be a planned unit development. Marina City is 3. Somehow that doesn't matter. Right? It goes ahead, and it really does set the tone for other large-scale projects like that. It's also one of the first large apartment projects in Chicago to be integrated, because the feds require it, and the janitors union is an integrated union. And one of the sort of most interesting things that I found in the research was an article in Ebony magazine that said basically Marina City is like how to do it, right? Like this is the first step in Chicago sort of gradually opening up its housing market. So it's an important project on all kinds of levels.
And then the architect, Bertrand Goldberg, Bud Goldberg, many of us here know his work and knew him personally. Talk about his influence in making sure that this was, at least before it all went kablooey in the 70s, his influence in making sure that this was going to be a unique place.
Yeah, his idea about Marina City was that he wanted literally to make a city in the middle of Chicago's business district, and to do that, he thought it was important to have that kind of mix of things to do and places to live. So you not only live in Marina City, but there's an office block behind it, so maybe you work there too. There was a movie theater, now House of Blues, so you can go see a show without going too far. You can park your car, you can park your boat, right? All of these things Goldberg thought were really vital, that instead of separating elements of the city out, instead of living in the suburbs and working downtown and going to entertainment somewhere else, that you would do this all in one place, right, and make a sort of vital, like thriving kind of kernel in the middle of the city.
And this thing is a sensation. I mean, you talk about in your book, you show ads. There's a movie, and finally it's on YouTube. Okay, this is my movie recommendation. It's Mickey 1. If you've never seen it, check it out. It's Warren Beatty. He gets in trouble with the mob, has to come to Chicago to get out of trouble, which seems like that would not be the thing to do, but it is. But there's a magnificent shot, I won't spoil it, of Marina City and some art that goes on there. I mean, this was really a thing when it was built, eh?
Yeah, it was the space age project, right? It's in the early kind of Mercury Gemini era when it opens, and you get popular mechanics doing their cutaway of Marina City, how we're all going to live in the year 1979, that sort of thing, and it shows up everywhere. I mean, it's everyone's favorite film set, right? There's the famous car chase that ends with a splash that you can also find on YouTube, and then my favorite, and the one that made it into the book, is there's a great ad for a cheap bourbon that has people on the balconies kind of talking to one another. And it really was something completely new, right? Completely different and wildly popular.
And it happens in the face of middle class, well, particularly white flight in Chicago. So this was a way also to kind of take a stab at not preserving white flight, but take a stab at fighting against it a bit.
Countering it, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Exactly right. And that's a common theme in a lot of residential construction of the era, that Chicago is actually fairly successful in keeping a substantial professional population downtown. The apartments that were helped out with FHA mortgage insurance, that got tax breaks and zoning breaks from the city, actually did a reasonably good job of keeping a population downtown. Other parts of the city, it doesn't work like that, doesn't work so well. But there are projects also, particularly after the first condominium legislation gets passed in Illinois in the mid-60s, where you see developers who are literally trying to compete with the suburbs, right? You see ads for things like, have a 3-bedroom ranch home just, on the 14th floor. And that works to some extent. The suburbs certainly hold their own in that battle, but it is a sort of constant struggle, and one that meets with a lot more success than I think we realize sometimes, to keep the working population downtown.
Now with Marina City, it was essentially backwaters, warehouses, that kind of thing. But with Sandburg Village, it's a little different.
Yeah.
It's a at the time it's a predominantly Puerto Rican neighborhood. Some African American, some Black people there as well. Talk about the development of that as well.
Sure. Sandburg Village to me is almost sort of the anti-Marina City, and its genesis really comes about because the Magnificent Mile, the retail association, is worried about blight creeping in from the west. And they literally, through Arthur Rubloff, the developer, go to the city and say, we need something to defend against it. And the language is militarist the whole time. The city has done so-called slum clearance on the south side. They decide to do this on the north side, and they take out the 6 blocks that are Sandburg Village today. Rubloff, through some shenanigans that I'll leave to the reader, funnily enough, gets the commission, right, or wins the bid to build it. Solomon Corbell Bunns do what is a beautiful job of landscape design, of apartment building design. I mean, it is a beautiful project. But even today, when you walk on Clark or LaSalle, right, it opens up to Clark, and on LaSalle, it kind of builds up to a literal wall. Right? It's literally a kind of defensive piece. Cordwell, who did most of the design work, was a former RAF pilot in World War II, and he literally talked about it as a beachhead. So even though I find it architecturally a really good project, I think it's evidence too that these forces were put to very, I think in Marina City's case, unassailable good use. In the case of Sandburg Village, I think deeper questions come up about it.
They certainly do, and as we get into race, which your book does very, very well, there is this element of race, blight, as we talked about here, which becomes kind of a code word for something else that we all know. We're all adults, right? And you can see it from the South. You can see fear of it from downtown, fear of it from the Central Area Committee, which oddly enough I used to head back in the early 2000s. So it was interesting to look over the documents and think, whoa! I mean, they were just not shy about where this was going. But there were these real fears, and fears is not the word I want, but it's the one I can lay my hands on now. That that these forces pressing in from the west, from the south, from the north, will ultimately collapse into downtown.
Yeah, and some of the more inflammatory things that people like Rubloff say we're reporting, right, that the white population of Chicago was not comfortable with integration. And when you read about, Rubloff talking about the threats to the Magnificent Mile, he's doing reporting. He's simply talking about what the rest of the city often feels. There were real problems with housing on the south side. The slum clearance that today we look at and think, gosh, how inhumane to scoot that many people off of a site in order to build middle class housing. There were real problems, though. The housing along Federal Street was largely run by absentee landlords, white landlords who lived elsewhere in the city, who didn't keep the buildings up. And there was a genuine housing crisis after World War II that required some big actions for sure.
And this transformation is interesting. So the Chicago Housing Authority under Elizabeth Wood, are really building humane, low-scale kind of housing at first, right? I mean, there's out southeast, there's it's not Tinley Park. It's well, there's Algo Gardens straight south, but then to the east, like on 104th and Hoxie, there's another one kind of out there. There's Jane Addams homes. There's others. Talk about those homes architecturally, and then the switch to these massive high rises that we get a few decades later.
Yeah. It's, when we think about Chicago public housing, right, we all instantly, I think of the Taylor homes or Cabrini Green. But in the early 50s, Chicago had a reputation for designing very successful, very progressive public housing. Some of that was low-rise. The Lathrop homes are the ones I think we think of right away these days. But even in the early 1950s, the CHA was commissioning then very young architects like Harry Leese, architects like Keck and Keck, to do kind of mid-rise housing that was 7 or 8 or 10 stories, and with a tremendous amount of success. Progressive architecture devoted a whole issue to Chicago as the capital of public housing, right? The city that's doing it right. The kind of long march to the projects like Cabrini Green was both kind of local in that the aldermen still had veto power, and so-called scattered site housing wouldn't work. A white neighborhood would just flat out would not allow public housing, and the alderman would veto the site. So the city is constrained in where it can build public housing. The Eisenhower administration was less and less interested in socialist projects, as they called it, and so funding disappeared as well. And at the same time, the second wave of the Great Migration is putting more and more and more pressure on the public housing that Chicago has. So those factors all make it kind of inevitable that Chicago had to go up. Elizabeth Wood was one of the people who said high-rise housing is not going to work, right? This is not the way families live. As Bradford Hunt, who formerly of the Newberry Library has shown, the demographics, because of the families coming in, the demographics in the Taylor homes in Cabrini Green there was no way they were going to work. There were just so many children and so few adults that the social dynamics were going to be very different. And in the end, they were not great buildings. The budget cuts that happened stripped elevators, forced. One of the successful things about the early phases was the kind of galleries, the balconies that were both circulation and play areas, always had the kitchen next to them, so that a parent, in the 50s it was always assumed to be the mother, would have eyes on the street. And in the Taylor homes in particular, Al Shaw's design had to turn them inside out because of the need for spatial efficiency. So there are no eyes on the galleries, the elevators take 5 to 10 minutes, and things happen that start to metastasize. It's a long, slow, but ultimately really sort of horrifying march that starts with the best possible intentions in the early 50s and some genuinely good designs.
Yeah, because it's funny. You can look on YouTube; it pops in and out. You can see footage of Old Man Daly, Richard J., going to the ribbon cut, welcoming people to the new public housing. He wasn't doing that by 75, but by 55 he was. You talk in the book, speaking of good designs and those early things, and we're going to get to Hilliard Homes in a second, but you mentioned Dearborn Homes, which is just south, right? South of IIT? No, is it north?
Just north.
It's north of
Yep.
IIT. As one of the early high points of it, which I hadn't thought about, but looking at it and thinking about it, it's been altered a little bit now. It's not bad. Why was that a good point, a good high point?
Yeah, Dearborn Homes are probably, I think, as tall as Chicago public housing got successfully. And they weren't perfect. They had issues, but they were thoughtful. Gerald Lobel Schlossman Hockel was the sort of force behind it. And they were sensitive to the way that families lived. So there were shared play areas sort of around the core where 4 apartments would open onto an open space. And again, the kitchens and things were located so that there was always kind of a parent, at least sort of nearby. There were spaces to store baby carriages, and the density wasn't that great. They are today, even as you walk by them today, they're towers in the park. And the buildings are placed so that the green space is divided into sort of manageable areas. There was money invested in materials. They lasted they're still occupied today. And there were adequate elevators and things so that people weren't waiting for 10 minutes being vulnerable to being mugged or something like that. So a lot of small things that, in the case of Dearborn Homes, I think added up to, maybe not an architecturally great project, but a good one, like a genuinely good one.
Now, one that's probably great, at least by my eye, brings us back to our buddy Bertram Goldberg, is Hilliard Homes at 23rd and Clark State, somewhere in there. Way different, built at the same time, built 1966, finished 1966. Radically different than what was happening. How did that happen?
Yeah, Hilliard Homes was both a coincidence, a happy mistake, and then real dedication on the part of Goldberg. The project sort of merged together 2 housing projects that were supposed to be separate. So a kind of normal family housing project and a project for elderly housing. They ended up put together for budget reasons, but one of the things that seemed to make the denser projects work was that demographic mix of having more grown-ups than teenagers. And so just accidentally, the kind of demographics of Hilliard Homes were favorable. And then Goldberg was so diligent about thinking through how families lived, how the elderly lived. He had the radical step of inviting families into his office and taping out rooms on the floor and asking them, how would you do this? Like, where would you put the sofa? Where would you put the TV? A lot of research on his part, but also I think a lot of thought, and also hiring landscape architects who understood how children play. So it's not just a blank green space. There was a little like BMX track and things that I don't think's there anymore. So I think it was thinking about how you could take daily family life and transpose it into a high rise. Now, as an architect, the fact that it is just really like boss concrete, like I think that's a bonus, right? That it felt like the same kind of space age energy that came from Marina City was getting applied to public housing. And I think people understood that.
And really great. I mean, they're curved, they're cylindrical. There was an amphitheater. I don't know if the amphitheater is still there, but there was an amphitheater in there. But really, a step apart from what we were kind of getting public housing wise. Yeah. So we got the loop kind of coming back on its own. Well, coming back, I shouldn't say on its own. Daly is pushing it. We've got some things happening out in the neighborhoods. Talk about John Hancock. I'm 50. I'll be 58 this month, actually. And when I was a school kid, that was the building that we all drew on the back of our notebook paper, right? I mean, with the X-brace thing, because it would have been just completed when I was in first grade. So this was like the new hot building.
Yeah.
Talk about and in a way, it isn't far from the retail out in neighborhoods, the retail space on the first floor with the apartments above. It's just extruded. I mean, and it's done in a different way. But talk about the development. In fact, when I was at SOM years ago, not that many years ago though, there was talk that it was going to be two buildings, and then one kind of slab-like building. I think they called it the Pig, I think, and then it ended up being what it became, the far better design. Talk about that a bit in Fazl Khan and Bruce Graham's role in that.
Yeah, well, the Hancock, growing up downstate, coming into Chicago and seeing the Hancock, like, my parents still have the notebook with all the cross-braced structures in it, and it came together again in a way that was almost entirely unexpected. So the original developer was Jerry Woolman. He was from Philadelphia. He owned the Eagles. That was his sort of claim to fame.
That's right.
But he saw this site that other developers had looked at, way too big, almost the whole block, and thought, well, you could make some money off it if you thought really big, if you built an office building and an apartment building. And so SOM very diligently designed an office building and an apartment building. And the problem was that the site wasn't really big enough for both, right? You couldn't get the buildings arranged so that you could look out of the office and not be looking right into an apartment. And the story, take this with a grain of salt, but this one seems to have some legs to it, is that finally Bruce Graham just took the apartment tower and put it on top of the office tower, right? And the problem with that is that apartment floor plates tend to be skinny, right? Because we like to be near windows when we're in our apartments. Office floors want to be deep, or at least they did then, because you've got the executive on the outside, and then you've got the clerical staff who don't need windows on the inside. So the office building is this thick, the apartment building is this thick, right? And Fazl Khan is the one who said, well, if you make it so the apartment floors are maybe just a little too deep here, that matches up with office floors that are just a little bit too skinny here. And that works with a very good wind bracing shape, right? The Hancock's got its feet spread apart, so it resists the wind real well. And at the same time, Fazl Khan is playing around with this idea about tube structures, right? About putting all the structure on the outside of the building. And the way I explain this to students is if you take a paper towel tube, right, just a raw cardboard tube, and push down on it, right, it's got some stiffness to it, it's not going to buckle. If you slice that paper towel tube and roll it up and try to push down on it, right, it's going to buckle. And the Hancock basically is a paper towel tube in steel and big, but all the structure's on the outside, so it's really efficient. And the developer is worried that the cross bracing, of course, is going to get in people's way. And now we know that if you've got a unit with the cross bracing in it, those are the expensive ones, right? It's become. So the design of it is just this really happy coincidence of a building this tall that wants a floor plate here that's this big, a floor plate here that's that big. Oh, by the way, down on the lower floors, the parking garage ends up being exactly the right width. And there was a department store at the bottom that was also just about the perfect width. So all those coincidences line up. The structural engineer is happy, the architect is happy, the developer is happy, and we get an icon up on the lakeshore.
And it really is. I still think it's the finest tall building, even now, 50 some odd years later. I still think it's if not one of the finest tall buildings in the world. I think. And let's see. I'm trying to see the back with my reading glasses. So it's 6:45, I guess. So we got the 5 minutes before we open up to Q&A. But what you just described talks about something that we've kind of overlooked a little bit, but your book does not. Your book really gets into this really well, which is building technology. These things aren't just these skyscrapers aren't just sort of slapped up. I mean, there's some real rigor going on there and other buildings. The field building was one that you mentioned a lot, going back to the 30s, which is one that I forget about, actually. But talk about the field building, but talk about how technology plays a role in bringing about these buildings.
Yeah, well, my background is I'm a building tech nerd, right? That's my almost official title down in Champaign. So of course I'm going to get into the nuts and bolts. The field building ended the first book, right? And to me, it starts this book because it is right. It is like the hinge point to me in the way that the technology of the skyscraper evolves. It's just about the tallest building in Chicago when it's built in 1934. So electric elevators, a moment frame for its steel skeleton, a stiff wind-bracing steel frame. Electric lighting, which is not something that first book starts out with, right? Electric lighting is an important technology. But if you look at the upper stories of the field building, it's got a sort of thin slab, and then it has these 4 lobes, right? It's like a 4-leaf clover in plan. And the reason is that they still had to naturally ventilate offices. Right? In 1934, you still had to open the windows and let air blow through. So when you look at buildings of that era, you always see either a light court on the inside, or in the 20s, they realized you can turn that out, and everyone gets not only light, but views. So the upper floors of the field building are kind of an old-fashioned, naturally ventilated building. At the base of the field building, it takes up the whole half block. And the only way they could do that was to seal the building up and use this new technology called air conditioning. And the field building is the first new commercial construction in Chicago to be air conditioned, just the first 5 floors. But to me, that's a key moment because the air conditioner is one of the things that drives the scale of the post-war skyscraper in a way that's very, very different from the pre-war skyscraper. And the field is the one that very gently sort of pioneers that.
It doesn't quite get the respect that it probably should, do you think, architecturally, or do you think maybe it does?
I think it probably deserves a little more notice than it gets. It was famously the last skyscraper built in the Loop for 20 years. And I think that when things came back, like when the Prudential was built, the next skyscraper, one of the critiques was, well, it looks an awful lot like the field building, right? It's got sort of vertical limestone stripes, and okay, it's asymmetrical, but it feels too much like the building of the past. And the field building, I think, got a sort of reputation as the last old-fashioned skyscraper. And in fact, I think we ought to look at it as one of the buildings that really sort of pointed toward what was coming next.
Yeah, because there's a huge difference between the Prudential and, say, Mies' 860, 880, which is older, right, by a handful of years. One does look like the past, while one clearly beckons to the future.
Very much.
You talk about talk about Mies a bit. We got about 2 minutes, I guess.
Sorry, did you say 2 minutes or 2 hours?
Because we could go either way. I know. I wish we had 2 hours, right?
Yeah.
But his influence. He's here. Winds up at IIT, but talk about the influence that he ends up having on architecture globally, but from here.
Yeah. So in the first chapter, I juxtaposed there's a portrait of Mies and a portrait of Daly, and to me, those are the 2 really key figures that I think that we can possibly overstate the influence of Mies. Like I think that the kind of old school histories, he's like the second coming of Louis Sullivan, and Chicago is kind of born anew when he lands and all that. No, that's not quite the case, but certainly no one had a more powerful influence on the kind of style or the philosophy of skyscraper design and construction here. And not only as a practitioner, I mean, 860, 880 to me still, they still draw tourists from all over the world. They're timeless buildings. But also, obviously, the influence he had at IIT, where that was a kind of think tank for not just skyscrapers, but all sorts of architecture that we come to think of as Chicagoan. And having that kind of practice downtown and the sort of laboratory at IIT, I think, was really crucial to developing his approach, but also the approach that we come to think of as the Chicago School.
Well, one thing I want to, before we get to it, and I guess I'll know when it's time to ask questions when they give me that iPad, I guess. So whenever you, okay, we're good. Okay, good. One of the things that I want to talk about a bit, we talk about the neighborhoods and the tall buildings in the neighborhoods, and we talked about it in terms of public housing. But there's also something interesting happening on the lakefront in Bronzeville with Lake Meadows, right? The construction of Lake Meadows, which actually is for sale now after 5 million years of ownership by Draper and Kramer. Talk about the development of Lake Meadows. it bulldozed the neighborhood that that my father grew up in, actually.
Yeah.
But he obviously he wasn't the only one. Talk about the development of Lake Meadows and the impact that it had.
Yeah. So Lake Meadows was important as a sort of show of faith on the part of New York life. It's the first really, really big investment in Chicago real estate after World War II. And the idea behind it was, again, to take what was thought of as substandard housing, a lot of it in that neighborhood was at the time, and to try to replace it with modern housing that would be kind of good for the city, good for the developer, hopefully good for people living there. And it had this long, like very, very tortured process of actually coming to fruition. There are early schemes by a designer at SOM named Ambrose Richardson that to me are like the great lost cause. There are these 1,000-foot long Corbusian sort of unité shapes that end up getting broken up into the 4 towers that are there now. But they're important for a couple of reasons. One is that that's the first time where someone is coming in and looking at a really, really massive project for the middle class in high rises. And the intent really was to provide middle class housing for Bronzeville. And it did. It displaced many, many more people than it housed. So the math gets a little suspect. But it also did a number of things kind of technologically. John Merrill of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill was a housing expert, and he really sort of pioneered a lot of the kind of planning strategies, a lot of the curtain wall strategies. It's a curtain wall that's not quite as pretty maybe as 860, 880, but important nonetheless. And it proved that you could successfully turn a profit on housing middle-class residents on the South Side. And it was the first of several projects that had mixed success, but some of them, like South Commons, quite successful, to show that the skyscraper was not just for public housing, but it could be for middle-class housing as well.
That's a good point. It does bring a kind of it does father a few children. It does. There's South Commons, there's Prairie Shores. And they're all so close to each other. So yeah. Architecturally, I still struggle with it. I think the modernist in me likes to look at it. When I was in college, I would visit friends there. Didn't necessarily like the architecture on of the inside. But what do you think of it? And not although it's not a skyscraper, there's a great medical building there that just got restored right there on 35th, 31st.
Right. Yeah, 31st on the north side of it. Yeah.
That got restored by I think Johnson and Lee, and it looks good.
Yeah,
it looks good.
Yeah.
But architecturally, what did it give us? Do you think?
Well, I think it gave us a sort of quote unquote European example to follow. It is, the design of it is like 70 years old now, so it can look a little tired, I think, to my eyes. But I think that it also, even though the kind of, there's a lot more open space than there probably needs to be.
It is a lot.
But there are these moments where you realize that, Merrill was a gifted architect, right? A gifted modernist. And I think that there are things that track through from that. I think that if you're down looking at Lake Meadows, I would go a couple blocks west and look at Lawless Gardens. Lawless Gardens to me are the unsung heroes of residential high rises in Chicago. John Matusami designed. He had to hook up with a residential firm called Dubin and Black. But those 3 towers and the townhouses that went with them, in I think it was 1970, I can't remember the exact year, but they won an AIA chapter award, and they beat out the Hancock.
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
That's right.
And I tell people, go see Lawless Gardens, and everyone just says, what, where? And believe me, they are beautiful concrete high rises. Like if Mies had done exposed concrete middle-class high-rises, I think these are what they'd look like. Matusami was an IIT grad. And that firm then went on to design a couple dozen high-rises all over the city. They developed this system of flying ribbed formwork. And once you see it, you realize that they were everywhere. right? And they were at every kind of price point. They did middle-class housing, they did public housing. There are a couple in Streeterville and the Gold Coast where they use the same technique. And it is amazing. Once you recognize the kind of ribbed form, you realize that these guys took what they'd learned from Lawless Gardens, which of course learned from Lake Meadows, and really populated the skyline quietly but effectively.
I'm glad. I was glad to see John Matusami get some shine, if you will, in the book. I mean, certainly overlooked black architect, certainly overlooked, semi-overlooked in kind of architectural canon, but he's kind of now getting into getting into the public eye, if you will. Also did a great one, if you're ever in Bronzeville, Luther Terrace. At 47 South King Drive, something like that. You can't miss it if you go down King Drive. It could be at home on Lakeshore Drive, as well as it is here. It's a great work. You know, one I want to get to real quickly before we get to the questions. Sears Tower. What do you? I mean, obviously that's kind of like Daly's swan song in terms of he begins in the 50s. You know, Sears Tower is built. I can't call it Willis. I know you guys are giggling, but
it's spelled Willis. It's pronounced Sears.
That's right. That's right. I like that. But this was really something, right? I mean, both in terms of building tech, the size, sending the message about how Chicago wants to project itself. Talk about the impact of Sears Tower.
I mean, Sears is really the best ratification of Daly's strategy, right? That he manages to convince a Chicago company not just to stay in the city, but to move from Lawndale to the Loop and to build 4 million square feet of office space, which is, I mean, today we know it's a ridiculous amount of office space. And the Daly showed up at every announcement for every commercial skyscraper and every groundbreaking. But the picture of him that I found that's in the book, you can just see that you get the sense that he understands that this is what it's all been leading up to. Right? That this is the biggest possible vote of confidence in what he's done. They turned to SOM, who of course Fosler Khan says, well, we've solved the problem with the Hancock. We'll just do another one of those right there. And Sears interestingly says, no, like, you got to do something else because that's so iconic. And to Khan, the engineer, like, that's the solution. That's the answer. Like, it's going to cost you more money to do something else. But Sears wants its own image. And so the structure of Sears is related but different to the Hancock. In some ways, it's the kind of inverse of the cross bracing. It's a really, really stiff moment frame, more like the field building than anything else. But it's a record breaker, right? And a record breaker in Chicago, which for Daly was super important.
Very good. Now let's go to some questions. First question: Marina City started as rental housing. Was there always a plan to convert it to condominiums? I moved there as a renter in 1975.
Oh, wow! Lucky you. They're great apartments. It couldn't have been planned as condominiums because condominiums didn't exist in 1961. The history of real estate law is a rabbit hole that I don't ever need to go down again, but originally, like, real estate means what it says, that you have to own a piece of land to have title to something, and in a high-rise, that's a problem. And it's not until the mid-'60s that Illinois and California and Puerto Rico figure out legal ways to sell you a title to basically a slice of sky. So the condominium ends up being a hugely important event, but Marina City was always planned as apartments.
Okay, let's pick one to start a fist fight. The home of the first skyscraper is ellipsis question mark.
Ooh, yeah, this is a tough one. I was on a panel in New York once that asked this question, and my response was, there's no such thing as the first skyscraper, and it was built in Chicago. The standard myth is that it's the home insurance, right? But that was debunked in the 30s, and the argument had to do with, was it the first iron frame? Did the brick do anything to support the iron? Was it, And it's just too messy to look at it and say, oh, that's a like fundamental break. The argument I made, because they made me pick one, is the Fisher Building on South Dearborn.
Really? I know that building well. So the Fisher Building right next to the library, just sort of north. And why that one?
So that one was the first skyscraper to have a steel frame and a terracotta and glass skin and no masonry. No bricks for structure, no bricks for the cladding. And when Inland Architect wrote about it, they said, this is the most amazing thing in human history because it's a tall building that was built entirely without walls. And what they meant was it had no brick walls. So if I'm forced to choose, if someone's going to fly me out to New York to choose a first skyscraper, to me, there are not a lot of arguments better than, oh, that's the first tall building to be built without this structural system that we've been using for 3,000 years.
All right. Got some applause out of there.
So, I should say no one else in the world thinks this.
Well, it's like everything else. It starts here, then it spreads everywhere else.
Exactly. Sorry? It depends on where you're from. So my good friend Don Friedman in New York thinks the Produce Exchange in New York is the first skyscraper. Come on. If you talk to a Parisian historian, they will say, well, the Eiffel Tower, clearly. If you talk to a British historian, they will say the Crystal Palace has everything in it that all your Chicago skyscrapers have. I don't even want to get into what an Egyptian historian would say, right? To me, I love being involved in these debates, not so much because there's an answer, right? My response is always like, show me what the first fish was, and then we can talk about what the first skyscraper is. But having the debate, I think, always dredges up these issues about, well, how was it built? How does that matter? And I think that to me is the interesting part, is getting people to talk about the technology in a way that admittedly has very low stakes, but is I think enjoyable and I think useful.